My name is Knapp Bachmann. I'm here to talk about transitioning from developing software to developing people. So, a little bit about myself. I joined an organization named Lolo.com a little under a year ago. Within the first month there or so, an opportunity to become a manager came, and I jumped on it. It's something I've been wanting to do for a long time now. I bring that up early in this talk because I need people to understand that this is not a talk where I bring in years of engineering management experience or an encyclopedic knowledge of engineering management theory. This is a talk where I'm going to discuss the experience I had transitioning from that individual contributor role to that manager role. And it's the kind of information I wish I fully grokked before I made the decision. And it's the kind of information I think would be super valuable to an individual contributor who is considering becoming a manager. And on that note, the first thing we need to talk about is that management is a role about people. You're working with people all day long. You're talking with people within your team. You're talking with people outside your team. You're talking with managers to execute on business goals. You're talking with other departments to make sure that they're getting what they need from you. So if you don't enjoy working with people, you're going to have a hard time in management. It doesn't mean that you can't be an introvert. I consider myself an introvert in a lot of ways, but the thing is, I enjoy the interactions I have with people. And if you don't enjoy working with people, you're going to have just a really hard time being successful as a manager. And on that note, as a manager, you're the primary point person for your team. If anyone has questions about what your team works on, they're likely coming to you. If people need things that they think your team could be helpful with, they're going to probably reach out to you first. And you really need to have almost a customer service affect. You need to be able to take people's requests and be helpful or informative or just really just approachable. If you're someone who people don't feel good after they talk with you, they're going to stop talking with you and your team's going to miss out on opportunities, or you personally are going to miss information that you wish you'd had. You want to be someone that people are excited to reach out to, essentially. On a similar but different note, is that as a manager, you're a bit of a buffer for your team. You have extremely valuable resource in your engineers. They're been given important goals. If what they're working on isn't important, you probably would have given them something else to work on. And as such, you need to make sure that they are working on those goals as much as possible. And what that means is you're taking in underdeveloped ideas and make sure they're fully fleshed out before they get to your team. You're taking distractions and you're handling them before they get to your team. You're identifying roadblocks and you're clearing those roadblocks before they become a problem. And that doesn't mean you never bring your team in, but the idea is if you're distracting them from what they're working on, you're going to slow down those things, and you just really want to make sure you're doing that as little as possible. And that's sort of the macro view of management as far as the wider organization is concerned. But as a manager, you're also a bit of a career coach for the engineers. Earlier, I said your individual contributors are extremely valuable, and that's true. But you can always be made more valuable. And as you're trying to work with them, you're trying to coach them on their career. You're trying to show them things that they're doing well and show them ways that they can do a little bit better. Because if you're able to do this successfully, your team will become more valuable over time. But ignoring the whole idea of like value to the organization for just a second, the fact of the matter is if your team doesn't get value from working with you or if they're not growing in their role, they're probably going to realize that they can do better elsewhere and either leave your team or leave your organization. You really want to make sure that the people on your team feel like they're getting a lot out of what they do. And so that's what primarily one-on-ones are for, but also a lot of the interactions you have day to day is making sure that you're aligning people with the projects that best fit their individual goals, what they want out of the role. So now we talked about what management is, I thought we'd go into some of the reasons why management might not be the right call for you. If you're getting into management because you see it as a promotion or the next rung on a ladder, you might want to stop for a second because you don't need to climb a ladder just because you see one. When you take any promotion, this is advice that goes beyond the whole transition from individual contributor to manager. If you take any promotion, what you're essentially doing is changing the perceived role. You need to be mindful if that's something you really want to do because there's actually nothing wrong with staying where you're currently at for the most part. If it's something you really enjoy doing, and if you look up at the next step and you say, I don't really like what goes on there, then you don't need to take that. Management in particular is not really a promotion. You're going to get a lot of people congratulating you for the promotion or saying, wow, it's cool you got promoted. You need to understand that what you're actually doing is changing the role that you're working on. You're changing what you do from day to day, and you need to be mindful about that. Another reason why management may not be the right call is if you're getting into it because you want power. If you're frustrated with how your organization's going and you see management as a way of making changes to that organization, I think you're not entirely wrong. You are granted some power as a manager. You are given a team who should be working on what you tell them to work on, but at the end of the day, the power you're granted as a manager is fairly imaginary. And your primary skill as a manager is that of influence. And influence is something you can execute on even as an individual contributor. In fact, you'd have to do it a lot as an individual contributor. And if you're having trouble influencing your organization from an individual contributor role, I think you're going to have a lot more problems trying to do that as a manager. Because, like, for example, as an individual contributor, you're one writing the code and you get to make a whole lot of decisions. And as a manager, yeah, you can sort of steer the ship, but if you're not able to convince the people you are managing that the team's doing the right thing, you're going to be fighting them constantly and you're not going to get anything done. And at the same time, you're going to have a lot of trouble working with people outside of your team who you have literally zero power over. What you have is the ability to influence. So develop that skill of influence as an individual contributor. And when you're able to influence people, you take on the title to match. And if you are ready to work with people, then take on manager. Do not become a manager for power. It is a lie. So now we've talked about some of the reasons why you might not want to consider management. Let's talk about some good reasons to consider management. Things that if they ring true for you, management might be a good role for you. First of which is you need to be motivated and energized by the success of people around you. We'll get into this a little bit more later, but as a manager, your role is to enable others to get things done, and you're going to be have to get certain enjoyment out of the success of the people on your team because they're the ones doing the most visible things. They're the ones building the stuff that your team's working on. You're just enabling them to do it. And if you're not able to get some motivation out of the wider team success, if you're not able to be motivated by the idea of helping your team succeed, you're going to have a hard time doing this for any period of time. The next thing is you need to be comfortable with perspective taking. It takes, I think, a high level of empathy to be a good manager. You're going to be dealing with people all day long, and if you're not good at empathy, you're going to have a hard time dealing with people all day long, but you're also in a lot of conflicts, and not necessarily fights, but you're going to have a lot of competing objectives. You're going to have disagreements about how to go about things, and if you're able to take the perspective of other people, you're more often than not going to be able to find positive some solutions or compromises that lead to both parties winning out, whereas if you are not able to see where people are coming from, you're going to have a hard time doing that. I'm not saying that you can make everybody happy. I'm not saying that every disagreement will become a beautiful solution where everybody wins, but I'm saying that if you're able to look past the disagreement and look towards the goals the other people have, you're more likely to find those solutions. You really need to enjoy thinking about team and organizational dynamics. Take an idea, how does it become a project? Not a product, but a project. What are the steps that need to happen in order for that idea to be executed on? Working with your team to break that project down into Jira tickets, working with other teams and organizations to figure out dependencies and how to make sure that this idea can be done well, and also aligning individual needs to organizational objectives. This actually gets back to the whole empathy thing I was talking about a second ago, where you want to take the needs of the organization, align that with the needs of your team, and align that again with the needs of the individual contributors on your team. And this gets into that individual coaching I was talking about a few slides back, where you want to make sure your team's growing and you want to make sure that the organization's winning. And wherever possible, you want to align these things such that your individuals getting what they need leads to the organization getting what it needs, which leads to the company being successful. So what changes when you become a manager? The first thing is code is no longer your primary job. As I said earlier, management's about people. You're being that stopgap that's making sure the stuff gets to your team only when it's fully formed. You're the one working with the rest of the organization to make sure engineering is well represented in the company. You're the one working with the product and design and getting work sent to the team. As such, you're not going to be coding all day, every day. In fact, you may go days without coding. But I said primary with intent. You should always have a technical understanding of the systems your team works on. And early on in your career, I don't think it'd be valuable to get rid of coding entirely. In fact, I personally have trouble imagining a world where I get completely away from the code. So how do you keep your coding edge sharp when you're not coding most of the time? You should still take on projects. You should still work on features and bugs, and help debug things when production outages happen. But the key thing is, the most important thing is that you stay off the critical path. It's fine to work on a feature, but it can't be one where if it doesn't get done, your team fails or your team's hurt. What you need to be doing is identifying things you can work on where you can put them down when you have to take on some organizational tasks. The worst thing that can happen as a manager after spending all your energy making sure the team's working effectively is for you to have taken on this critical piece of functionality just to get pulled off of it for a week and then end up blocking your team because you have chosen poorly. You need to understand that you need to be focused on the people stuff first and finding projects you can work on independently. The next thing is success becomes a lot fuzzier. You're no longer able to point to things and say, hey, I made that, at least not as often. The success that you're going to be measured on is the success of your team. And that can be a fuzzier thing. It can sometimes be hard to clearly communicate the value you're adding. You need to be comfortable with that and realize the work you're doing is work and is adding value, even if it's not immediately obvious by looking at the product. I think any engineer who's been in this business long enough knows the difference between a good manager and a bad manager and the value a good manager brings. And you need to get better at identifying that and being able to use that for your own motivation while also communicating that value to others. The next thing is your calendar gets a lot more complicated. This is a screenshot of my calendar that I blurred out. And as you can see, it's pretty full. And you're no longer in a situation like I was before being a manager where you go, geez, I have 2 meetings today. I'm never going to get anything done. You're in a situation where most days you're going to have meetings, and some days you're going to have nothing but meetings. And you need to start thinking about your calendar more strategically. And I'm going to go on a small digression here. The first thing is, busy is not the same as productive. You need to have some self-awareness and ask yourself, are you being productive, or are you just signaling productivity? I want to be clear, I am guilty of this. I am often jumping into 100 Slack channels, making noise, looking very busy while not getting anything that important done. And I think people need to be self-aware of when they're doing which and trying to make decisions about being mindful of what they work on. The first thing is develop a task management system. I like David Allen's Getting Things Done. However, a simple to-do list is fine. Maybe you do Kanban or Scrum for yourself, but the point is organize tasks. Get ideas out of your head and onto paper or digitally as fast as you can, because your brain is for ideas, it's not for memory, not really. And if you don't get organized, you're going to drop things. You're going to lose track of what's important and what's just immediate. So you need to develop a task management system and use it. The next thing is, you have a lot of meetings. That's a fact. But you need to learn that participating and leading a meeting is a skill. You need to develop it, but you also need to demand people around you learn it. Because a lot of the meetings you're in are not necessarily in your control. So, as best you can, have effective meetings, but provide the feedback to your organization that ineffective meetings are not acceptable, and whenever possible, we shouldn't have them. So, some tips on that. Meetings should have a goal. Meetings should have action items. Meetings are allowed to end early. Small meetings with a few people, are for decisions, and large meetings are more for brainstorming and broadcasting ideas. And yes, sometimes broadcasting ideas is better done over email. Some people never read emails, and you just have to broadcast, and sometimes a meeting's the way you do that. But, like I said earlier, you should have these things in mind, and if you find yourself in meetings that don't have a goal or don't have action items, provide that feedback. Push back, and as best you can, without being a jerk, demand that other people have these skills as well, because they're taking your time, and you really need to use your time effectively, because you can easily be driven by a calendar you have no control over otherwise. The last thing that changes is a lot fuzzier. It's a lot harder to really explain it, but the short version is people start to look to you when something goes wrong or there's something that people don't know. You'll notice that the room starts to look towards you for an answer, and you may not always have one. In fact, you almost certainly don't have one. And you just need to be ready for that and be willing to sort of embrace that uncertainty and be someone who's able to drive the team. I'm not saying have false bravado. I'm not saying lie. You can say it's okay to say you don't know, but you just need to be ready to provide something when the team looks to you and is asking what to do. And now I want to talk about something that might be a little bit controversial, or at least when I've talked to people about it, I've gotten some pushback, and that's politics, specifically office politics. I think it can be a bit of a third rail in an engineering organization because I think there's this idea that engineers should be above politics, that the right code is the right code and that's what gets done. And I think this is a fairly naive idea. If I have any influence at all in this talk, I want to put the idea out there that politics is a thing that just needs to be understood. It's a fact of life. And the definition of politics I work with is politics is how groups of people collaborate and make decisions. So any organization you're a part of has to make decisions, and they have some system for making those decisions. Even if you're a completely hierarchy-less organization and there are no bosses, you still have informal relationships and informal systems that exist to make decisions, because ultimately you have to make calls about what to do. And if you want to have your idea implemented, you need to work with the system. So, as a manager, as anyone really, but especially as a manager, you ignore politics at your peril. Having the right idea doesn't matter if you don't know how to get that idea through the organization. So, at this point, I want to remind you that if you become a manager, you are granted a little bit of power, but that power is imaginary. It is your responsibility to use what little power you have and combine that with an understanding of how the organization works to get the right things done. And especially as an early manager, relationships are critical. You can't do anything without having strong relationships with your team, with other managers, with the rest of the organization. I, as a manager, would be completely worthless if I didn't have a strong relationship with my designer, my product manager, and the other people on my team. So, a couple things you need to understand is your job, one of your jobs as a manager, is to advocate for your team. But you need to remember that the other teams are on your side as well. You're all on the same team ultimately, trying to build things that the organization needs. But there are going to be times when there's projects that no one really wants to do, and there's some jockeying about who ends up doing it. And your job is to advocate for your team, and their job is to advocate for their team. But I would stress that you need to have a bit of a give and take. You need to help teams out when you can, and then ask for help when you need it. Or say, I can't take on that job right now because we're working on X, Y, and Z. And you need to keep those relationships intact. You can't have a scorched earth policy. So whenever possible, look for a collaborative solution. Look for something that makes everyone better off. And that won't always be possible, but put the effort in, because you want to keep your relationship strong. So one last topic I want to discuss around politics, or at least somewhat tangentially around politics, is the idea of team branding. Team branding is really important. So what you see on the screen here is logos, and I want to be clear that I wasn't responsible for these logos, but I love them. My team actually put these together. The one on the right was entirely by my designer. The one on the left was actually a collaboration between my designer and a few of my engineers. And I was even in a situation where I was somewhat pushing against a little bit of this branding early on because I was worried that it wasn't super clear. It was very fun, but not very clear. But over time, I've learned that I have been very wrong. So what my team works on is customer support tooling, and we call our customer support team the Wombats. So we're the Womgineers. And that's part of the idea of setting a team identity, but really your goal is to make sure that everyone in the organization knows what your team does and what they don't do. Because if you don't define that well, if you don't have a team vision, you run the risk of having your roadmap dominated by other teams declaring you as a dependency. And this is why sometimes, if you've ever been in a meeting where your manager's sitting with the team trying to define this, it might feel silly at the time, but what's going on is you're trying to establish the boundaries and what kind of stuff you can lay claim to and what kind of stuff you can say doesn't fit. And customer support's actually a very clear case of needing to do this because it's very easy to create a situation where support needs a thing, therefore your team will build it. So an example is, let's say you released a feature around two-factor authentication, but you didn't actually build the ability to change your phone number. And suddenly you put together some hack, so there's an API to change your phone number, but it's not in the product yet, so support uses it when people call in. Now, suddenly it can be very easy to argue that your team owns the phone number feature because without it, support engineers can't do their job. That's a gap in the product. Changing the phone number should be functionality that belongs to the user, that support might have access to, maybe, but primarily that is a feature that belongs to the user. Our team builds features that are for the support agent first and supports the mission of collecting information to identify the problem the user is having and give the user the information they need to solve it, and in some cases, solving it themselves. We build tools that aid visibility, that get agents information they need, and we build tools that are designed for them. It is not our job to fill in gaps in the product. Now, that being said, your team vision should be somewhat flexible. If there's some aspect that you want to attack, adapting your vision to fit that can be beneficial. And also, keep in mind, give and take. So now we talk about politics of organization and defining your team within that organization such that people know what you work on. Let's talk about that pipeline of selecting projects and ultimately executing those projects. You don't have that much say in what your team works on. The product manager often selects what features you work on when, and the execs often will drop projects on your lap saying that you need to get this done. And that's fine, but what you as an engineering manager need to be able to do is influence that process and make sure that your team's set up for success. So the way you do that is you have a good process. And having a strong process gives you the tools you need to go through those conversations effectively. Every team has a process, even if that process is we wake up, we work on whatever we feel like working on, and if we get bored, we stop working on it. That's a very bad process. It's not one that gives you very many tools when it comes to discussing projects with other parts of the business. However, a process where work is estimated, that those estimates lead to measurements of capacity, and you go into every sprint or every month or every 6 months even with knowledge of how much your team can get done, that gives you a lot of tools in selecting projects. And we'll go into a little bit of an example. So you as a manager really want to find projects that the business values, but also fit and expand your team's skill set. So an example where these things can come into conflict is a mobile app could be super, super valuable for the business, but if you have 0 mobile developers, you're taking on a lot of risk by taking on that project. While if you have people on your team who are interested in mobile development, it could be beneficial to take on some part of that project such that you can expand your team's abilities into mobile, but you're not taking on a risk that your team can't effectively execute on. And another reason why you want to expand your team skill set, by the way, is that you want to keep your team interested in working at a sustainable pace. But ultimately, the idea of a process is to work with your team to estimate tasks, measure capacity, and get those tasks done in a timely manner. I spent easily the first 4 to 6 months at Lola working with my product manager, working with my designer, working with the rest of the team to define a process that worked for us. And we ultimately landed on Scrum, or at least a form of Scrum, where tickets get defined, we break those tickets down into parts, we estimate each ticket, and then every 2 weeks or so, we pull tickets in based on our capacity with the expectation that we're going to get those things done. And Now what I have is when a new project comes down the pipe and someone goes, "This is super important. We need to jump on this." I can say, "Okay, so my team does supports this. I see why this is important." And to be frank, my team's at capacity. So while I really want to work on this, if you feel like this is important enough, let's have a discussion about what work needs to come off this queue here in order to fit it in. So I would have my team estimate the work, then we'd compare that with other tickets and say, I think if we drop this project, we can slide this in. So which one of these two things is more important to you? And that's just an example of not taking on work just because someone says you need to do it, but to make sure you're taking on things in a mindful manner. The last thing I have to say on process is people are more important than process. People over process. It's not a phrase of mine. This is a Scrum phrase. And it's the idea that you need to adapt your process to the team you have and not to let the rules of the process override the people on your team. Ultimately, it's about them. So, if you're interested in learning more about processes, there's a lot of resources on this. You can look at Scrum, you can look at Kanban, you can define your own process. A lot of interesting stuff on there. So the last thing I want to get into today is the concept of reports growth. So as a manager, you have a strong incentive to keep your team growing and expanding. And I don't necessarily mean people, I mean the engineers on your team should be getting more valuable over time. They should be expanding their impact over time. And there's a lot of reasons for this. One, it's better for the business if the people they have are more valuable, so them becoming more valuable over time is a win. And also, your success as a manager is the team's success. Like I keep saying, your value is indirect. You're an enabler. So if you can't enable your team to have a bigger impact, your growth is going to be limited as well. You want to build up your engineers. But on a personal note, it's also just the right thing to do to keep an eye on making sure your engineers are getting something out of their time at your company. You're somewhat responsible for their careers. Not single handedly responsible, but you can be ethical about this and keep your team expanding and making sure that when they leave, they look back and go, those are good times. I learned a lot. It was valuable to me. Or you can not keep this in mind and ultimately have people leave going, you know what, it just didn't get a lot out of that position. And just, I'd feel terrible if people left my team frustrated and feeling like they've wasted their time. So, caring about engineers' growth means balancing the needs of the business with the needs of that engineer. It can not always work perfectly. Sometimes the business is going to win and you're going to be working on things that don't help the career that much. And sometimes you're going to make calls that give your engineers opportunity to grow, potentially at the cost of the business. I typically believe that if you trust people to get things done, they will figure out and get it done. For example, if you have an engineer who's really, really strong, you can keep giving them the most important projects. But if you keep doing that and not don't give other people a shot, you really run the risk of being overly dependent on that engineer. And what you really need to do is say, you know what? This might be short term bad for the business to give this project to another person, but that person's going to get a lot out of it, and the business will be stronger over time as we have more strong engineers on the team, and we haven't vested all our resources into one person who seemed strong right when they came in. And last thing on that is when you have a really strong engineer and you've been giving them all the important projects, you run a big risk for when they leave, leaving your team and the company in a bad position. So really put the effort into making sure that you're expanding the horizons of the people you work with and you're doing your best to divide up those responsibilities among everyone who you're responsible for. And the thing about career growth is it's a partnership. Ultimately, every engineer is responsible for their own career growth. If you're in a job where you don't feel like you're getting this, it is your responsibility to find a way to get it, either by joining a different team or leaving the organization or just really having a conversation with your manager. So it's not all on you as a manager to get these problems solved. It's a partnership. However, it's one where you have a big voice and you should be guiding them as best you can. So this last slide here is just some resources that I've found valuable that I wanted to share. The first is Help, I Have a Manager by Julia Evans. This is a short zine from the perspective of an individual contributor, teaching them what a manager does, what your relationship with a manager should be, and how you two can get the most out of each other. I found it super valuable when I was an individual contributor, and I also found it valuable as a manager in that it helps me uh, understand what I should be doing, and also helps me start those conversations with ICs. Next is A Manager's Path, A Guide to Tech Leaders in Navigating Growth and Change by Camille Fournier. This is probably the best book on management I've read. I really enjoyed it, and I also love that it grows with you. So if you're an individual contributor, even if you never go into management, I found this to be a very interesting book because it starts with you as a tech lead, then as a manager, then as a manager of other managers, all the way up to CTO, and it's just an interesting read cover to cover. Next, I suggest Marco Rogers as a Twitter follower. This thread in particular, that link I found very very interesting, as it talks about what the needs of a business and the needs of being a thoughtful and caring leader can be sometimes out of sync, and how stressful that can be. And it was a very eye-opening thread. And then finally, I have Ask a Manager. They're just a general the interesting blog about management, not necessarily technical management, but management in general, and they have a lot of good advice, interesting stories. And with that, I'm done. So thank you for staying, and talk to you later.